You're listening to the Kelly+Partners Investment Office Podcast, where you'll hear directly from some of Australia's leading CEOs of private companies that are in a high growth phase where we've taken an investment position. Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Kelly+Partners Investment Office Podcast, where we get the senior leadership of the investee companies that our Kelly+Partners Investment Special Opportunities Fund number 2 has invested in. In this instance, Paul Billing from Send Payments, the CEO, is joining us. Good afternoon, Paul.
Brett, Anoop, guys, pleasure. Thanks for having me today.
Terrific. And I'm joined by our Chief Investment Officer, Anoop Kalra. Good afternoon, Anoop.
Hey, Brett. Hi, Paul.
Hey, really nice to have this opportunity to chat. Paul, I'd love to start at the beginning. It's always a good place to start. Can you share with us your personal background and what led you to your current entrepreneurial adventure?
Yeah, I'd love to. My background, 11 years leading businesses in the payment space, probably across predominantly in Europe, and then the latter half of my career, Australia. As a rule of thumb, probably from inception to market leader across that period. So, growing FX businesses in the UK from inception in a hyper-competitive environment pretty quickly through to market leader in that retail space. So that's been very much my background for the last 11 years. And moved to Australia, I think October 2013 to do exactly what we just said then, set up a business from scratch as part of a wider group. Inside 4 years, grew that business to over 100 staff and market leader pretty quickly, right? So come over here, then learn a hell of a lot, got a few things wrong along the way, but ultimately that was the key decision for me that ended up taking me on that path to starting Send, right?
And what's the business case? How do you describe Send, and how do you think about the business case?
To probably start in my previous role would give some indication as to the why. When I was in my previous role, we got pretty good at working with other brands and helping them monetize the databases for FX, and in a very traditional referral sense. So, we would look after their clients and give them a share of any revenues generated from that said client, right? But what that meant is the cause and effect of that meant that we started to work with big brands, and we really started to deeply understand, how they viewed the world, how they were thinking about their consumer database, and ultimately how that was evolving and how that was changing, right? And they started to think less around offboarding and referring clients to other brands across any kind of financial service, and it was more about, okay, so how do we think about improving our attrition rates? How do we create greater share of wallet? How do we give better experiences to our customer base for products that should be synonymous with our brand? And there wasn't really anyone out there doing a particularly good job of that. That was definitely not who we were as a business from a commercial standpoint or a technology standpoint, importantly, because FX is notoriously difficult to tackle. But it was from that view, that belief that we could help big brands grow FX and payment products and become market leaders. They didn't have to be new brands at market, didn't have to be these big kind of powerhouse super apps, as we all kind of refer to them these days, that mature brands could do a great job of offering amazing products to a very loyal customer base. Probably from that belief is where Send was born.
And so who is your target customer? And what do you think they're looking for?
Our absolute DNA is definitely businesses and partnerships, right? I mean, that's first and foremost. How that looks for each of those businesses will differ slightly from business to business, right? It might be that they have a back office tool that they need help with to, from an e-commerce perspective, to be better and more competitive for making and receiving payments globally. You might have a brand that has a more of a B2C model, and for you, it's about new revenue streams and unlocking more value for that consumer base, where they might be going elsewhere to look for that type of product. So business is our DNA, but how we monetize and how we get that brand to market is very holistic. We look at the brand, we understand where the pain points are, and then we try to solve that with great product.
Terrific. So could you share with us some of your great clients and just to give our audience a sense of who you're working with?
Sure. I mean, for some context, we've been going since inception. We've probably been onboarding at a rate of about just over 4 partnerships a week, over the last 2.5 years. So in terms of the actual numbers of partners growing pretty exponentially, which is great. With that comes challenges in terms of priorities and focus. But in terms of brands at market, obviously working with yourself, so I'd probably be rude not to say that. But, if you look at some of the broader brands, we've just announced a partnership with Finsure as an example. We're about to announce probably our first free API clients. We can't say names just yet, but probably in the next kind of 2 to 3 weeks. And then some amazing traditional brands, market leading brands, typically the likes of TMG and the Flight Centre Group. We have, the Crowns and Graces in kind of the relocation spaces. Anything that typically touches movement of funds globally, we're working with the market leader in that space currently.
Why do you think you've been successful in getting brands like Flight Centre or some of the moving companies that you mentioned? What is it about your business model that has attracted them to deal with essentially what was a startup business when you won some of these contracts? Why didn't they go safe with some of the other FX kind of companies that exist in the market?
I mean, it's a really good question, right? And I think that this boils down to understanding the psyche of how these businesses think and what are the objections to market. And that probably falls into a couple of buckets, right? Ultimately, complexity and cost from a commercial level, and market validation from a consumer perspective, right? So how can we take a brand, remove any concerns or validate the opportunity for them is important, and being holistic around, okay, so how do we grow this from a small idea to making you that kind of go-to fintech in your market space, right? So that sounds obvious, but the reality is that if you start to peel back the layers around the infrastructure around payments, it's complex, it's slow, it's underpinned typically by archaic banking systems. So you have a lot of brands that are pivoting to this space that think, okay, business makes sense for me now. But if you really want to solve and fix the problems in this space, you have to start with that back office tool, and that's what we did. That's the view that we took. We had to make it cost effective to scale. So therefore, to stand these brands up, it costs us less than anyone else out there, which means that we can put more support into that relationship. We can be more flexible around commercials, and we can really help drive that growth in ways that other brands can. And then if you apply the logic of a brand not wanting something off the shelf, they want it to look and feel and be synonymous to their own core values, right? Is that you have to build product that is agnostic, that is modular in your approach. So then across those key components, if you can change and adapt a few little things, you give this perception of absolute alignment to the brand, even though there's patterns that you follow. So being flexible, being agnostic, and from a technology standpoint is critical, in addition to being understanding how to commercialize and grow that opportunity for the brand. And we see that week in, week out. If we look at these free API clients that we're about to announce in the next week or two, every single one of those we went up against, and I won't name drop for the purposes of the podcast, but we went up against multi-billion-dollar companies that have a wallet in their name and have been growing pretty quickly, right? And then others from Europe and elsewhere. So we know these brands, we know how to monetize this for them, and I think we know that we now have the technology which we've been busy building, thanks to your guys' help and a few other. We now have the ability to offer them the right product at the right commercials. So it's exciting. It's good.
In many ways, kind of FX conversion, it's quite a commoditized offering at the end of the day. It's a function of cost and rate. What is the benefit ultimately for your business partners in order for them to actually get their customers to transact? They need to be offering a competitive rate. How can a business of your size compete with some of the bigger players out there that deal with a much bigger liquidity pool?
It's a good question. It probably boils down to a couple of things. I think firstly, kind of refer back to the way that we built our product. A few key decisions drive that ability. So if we look at our competitor landscape, I think you've just called that out then, right? As a good example is, okay, so if we want to stand up a mature brand against a new disruptive brand, what are the key consumer requirements? Where it has to be cheap, it has to be fast, and it has to be great UI, UX, and a great customer experience, right? So, that means, so how do we compete with a brand? If we use a TransferWise or a Revolut as an example that have been at market for 15 years and raised hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, then it boils down to looking and learning from the mistakes they've made, what they've done well, and fixing the things that they didn't do particularly well. Very synonymous with back office. but also recognizing that there's an evolution in the fintech space of collaboration rather than competition. So we don't need to build if it doesn't make sense to. So we think about a lean technology stack, plugging in bits where we need to, retaining core IP where it makes sense to, means that we have a very mature product offering very quickly. We have local banking in all of our major currency flows domestically, so we can have real-time payments in. I don't really view FX margin or pricing as innovative. I think that's just very matter of fact. But how you bundle that in with all of the speed and the transparency and the flexibility around markups for that FX is probably a little bit more innovative. But making sure we're agnostic to technology and banking partners so we can plug in a plethora of different things means we can quickly scale and have that maturity to these brands. So we can compete 18 months in, to your point, Anoop, which we have been doing and winning deals, right? Because we're not frantically building the bits and the rails to connect this. We've built the core IP and then which is the brain, and then plugging these amazing kind of extras in as well.
And Paul, at the end of the day, the end customer wants to get a good FX rate. And I think what's often lost is, the major banks still probably control 70% of this market. And it's probably the one bit of banking where there isn't really great transparency as to what a market rate is. So when you compare yourself to the banks, what sort of advantage does the end customer typically get on an exchange rate compared to what they'd get at one of the majors?
I think you touched on a couple of really cool points there. Firstly, you're right. FX payments touches 1 in 2 of us in Australia, right? It's in our DNA. 1 in 2 of us have a parent born overseas. 1 in 3 of us are born overseas. We're one of the biggest importers, exporters in the world, right? It's just here. In terms of transparency and FX, I think globally the average markup for FX in the world, if we include the post office and the banks and Western Union as an example, is about 10%. So that's the real cost to you in terms of markup if you're moving money around across those traditional rails. Obviously, that's not to say if you own a bank and you have, if you own a company, you have good liquidity flows with your bank, and that you're going to be anywhere near that. You might be sitting at, say, 0.5%, but as a blend, that's where we sit. Transparency, and this is where TransferWise were very clever, is that they showed that cost to the consumer, and for us, we think about it slightly differently in that regard. For the consumer, what we're trying to do is balance fairness to both the business that we work with and to the end consumer. So making sure essentially as a business that we're pricing agnostic. But in order to do that, we really have to be as competitive, if not more competitive than anyone else in the market with pricing. So then we can go to the business and say, hey, if you want a product that looks and feels like TransferWise, then we can do that for you. But in actual fact, where TransferWise, because they're trying to acquire clients online, are spending, say, a couple of $1,000s per client, we can actually monetize that proposition for you when you compare them side by side. And that's when it becomes a really compelling thing, right?
It's one of the things that really attracted me, the B2B to C model or the B2E model. It just means that your cost of customer acquisition is just so much cheaper than these pure online players. And in fact, you're really just getting your partner to bring the customer to you, and it's an add-on to them. It's an additional service to their customer at no additional cost.
100%. Couldn't agree more. Our view on the world is that, if FX, like synonymous to any embedded finance product, right? If it's front of mind, then it's easy with a brand that you know and trust. You're going to use that, right? And to your point, that can be a tier 2 bank. It could be a credit union. It could be a Velocity. It could be a Qantas. It doesn't matter. But we are, as people, very loyal to brands, and we are creatures of habit, right? But if we can create an amazing experience that is of value to them, then there is no reason to go elsewhere and look for that product. So we're getting it in right at the very top of that journey. So therefore, there is no need for them to go elsewhere and start to go on Google and look for that alternative, right?
And the commercial relationship between you and the partner, can you give us a broad feeling on how that kind of works? I
can talk to the negative side of what I've seen over the years, where I think there's an absolute focus on just understanding what is wanted at a board level from a commercial standpoint in FX relationships, where it's okay, well, we'll give you a revenue share, or it looks like this. That doesn't work, right? Because if you look at the intricacies of businesses, you have to take an approach of, okay, so are they product first? Are they actually a company that is driven by reps. So there's an element of sales teams in there. And then we think about, is there kind of groups of people globally, and how do we bring culturally those businesses together to align that they're comfortable in using a product or, referring that product to us, right? So a good commercial relationship that we see, yes, it monetizes the product for the partner, but it also thinks about how do we grow that opportunity internally, and it puts focus and commercials in that direction to ensure that success. And that's where I've seen time and time again, these kind of relationships won on loss, right? It's on that particular detail. And again, if we revert back to how we built, we wouldn't be able to do that unless we built in a very lean kind of manner.
Paul, one of the other real attractions for us in the investment was that the senior management team had done it before, in building a similar sort of business in Australia from scratch. And, over a 4.5 period, you built something that was very, very powerful. When you reflect on the journey so far with Send Payments, how are you finding that pathway? And to me, the fact that you've done it before actually reduces the execution risk of doing it again, because you already know what some of the pitfalls are, and hopefully you won't make the same pitfall again. So I guess when you reflect, if it took 4.5 years last time to build a business that had 30 odd million in revenues, how are you tracking compared to your kind of expectations? And is it easier? Is it harder?
I think as a founder, it's never enough, right? I think that we're all, as any good business leader, you're always striving for more. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I think that you should never settle, right? You're always trying to drive forward. You're always trying to grow. If you'd ask me, do I think where we are is enough? My obvious initial answer is no, right? But equally, if I look at how far we've come in such a short space of time, it really is incredible. You look at the product we've built, you look at the team we've amassed. We're 50 strong now. Our revenues are growing through COVID, through travel bans, through wars, and we're growing and having record month to month, every single month. And that's down to that focus on what our partners want, which I think is key. So we're not taking a view where we've seen time and time again, particularly in this fintech ecosystem, right, where I think there is a view that if you build a product, the clients will come, whereas we come from the complete opposite direction, which is we understand our client base and we will build, we will collect them first, and we went to market early in order to do that. And then we will work with them, we will engage with them and make sure that we're building product that they want to use, so we can scale very quickly and efficiently off the back of that. And that's what we're seeing as a great working example right now with our API product, is that we've taken on board several clients, working with them in a very vanilla way. We validated the opportunity, and then they're coming back to us saying, okay, well, look, we want to integrate this into our product. We think there's that 10x opportunity with this, can we do it? And then understanding how that flow of funds works with them and learning and then replicating that from a TAM perspective. So, it's been an interesting journey, but the last 6 months has been incredible. I think if I look at what comes next from a growth perspective, that's the exciting bit for me. I think the foundations are now well and truly in place. We think about product and team and narrative and validation. So we've seen that we can execute bigger businesses. It really feels, and genuinely, you can almost touch it, right? It really does feel that we're kind of scaling pretty quickly from here because of all this work that's preceded us so far. So we're in a good spot.
And I think, Paul, that's a nice segue in terms of new product development. You started off with an FX transactional product, and we've expanded into API. Can you just talk us through what the future looks in terms of the other new products that you're working on?
Yep. I think to talk to that, you probably want to start at the beginning, which is ultimately, what is our goal? Our goal as a business is to get stickier and stickier with great brands, right? And we want to get deeper and deeper into their ecosystem. So, we think about back office and consumer facing product. In order to do that, we had to start at the very beginning, to your point, Anoop, right? Which is that we had to be at market. There had to be presence there. Otherwise, brands like Kelly+Partners, whoever else, just wouldn't give us the time of day. So we started very vanilla with referral products, and then we evolved that into white label products. And then we're about to ship not one, but 2 different APIs. So we think about our partner API, which is where we do a lot of heavy lifting for the client, or we have more of a trusted financial services model where we rely on some of their data in order to make that more seamless. Again, in terms of what comes next, it's a really good question, right? Like we have clients that are pushing us pretty hard for localized accounts. So we think about that B2B product and actually getting more mature, more competitive in that space and helping them with digital wallets. That's probably where we see the most demand right now. That's not to say that we don't have some amazingly big opportunities in the background for the likes of local spending cards. So, can we help people with local expenses that doubles up as an overseas expense card? And then we probably have probably the next bucket. And then we have the later bucket, right, which looks at forward or future proofing stuff. So, already we're getting feedback around things like BNPL and crypto and for us, if we think about our mission or our mission and vision statement, which is to be that innovations partner of choice, we have to bring all of that ecosystem, that payments ecosystem together and give that to partners. The challenge that we've got, to your point, Anoop, which is where I think in the now bucket, there has to be complete focus. We have to learn a little bit from the crypto space, right? Where they're almost guilty of spending a bunch of money because there's a different thing they're chasing each day. And for us, there's absolute laser focus on executing a few things, right? Which is, we want to grow revenues, but we want to grow certain types of revenues. We want to get, our first API clients to market and validate that. And we want to get our B2B proposition to market. So that's that probably complete FX product to market. What comes next thereafter?
What's the timeline on that, Paul?
In terms of the B2B product, we've solved that in a really cool way, right? So we're building, we talked about crypto, we've actually built, we've built our own wallets and ledger system, which is linked to AWS serverless. So it essentially is blockchain enabled, if we want to drop in some fad words there. But look, for the purposes of scalability, we've built that core IP. And now what we're looking at, the way that we solve the maturity of the FX product or the B2B product is that we'll probably plug in a few APIs to give that maturity around payment rails and complexity of different payment products. What that means from a timing perspective, Brett, is that we've gone from, say, launching that in, say, 2 years to probably about 2 months' time. And we're already kind of putting team in place to kind of, prepare ourselves to make sure that we've got clients at the top of funnel to execute that product.
We're not building products in the hope of finding a client. It's basically client-driven, saying we're really interested in having 100%. A product that does this. Can you find a solution for us or build a solution for us?
Always. I mean, how many times have we seen businesses fail in the last couple of years where it has been easier to raise money, but where they've had a great idea, but no client acquisition strategy? Yep. We that's not who we are. We don't really identify with that. So the challenge is, as we've grown by so many partnerships, is making sure that what we focus on and now and next is absolutely the top priorities, right? So if we think about RICE or complexity, cost, opportunity to market, we're constantly challenging. That's a living and breathing roadmap. We don't want to necessarily just have a fixed roadmap of we're building product A, B, C, D over the next 5 years. We are constantly looking at updates and product releases that really kind of either mean better efficiencies, better scale, better revenues, more margins in the existing ecosystem, and then looking at new that can support new revenue lines as well, right? So it has to be somewhat fluid in around what they're telling us they need.
Paul, over the next kind of 3 to 5 to 10 years, what do you hope this business to be? There's obviously a very large opportunity in terms of a market opportunity that's there, but realistically, what are your aims for the business over that time period?
First and foremost, in terms of vision, in terms of where we want to get to, I don't probably think that it's a 5 or 10 year journey. We think probably a little bit shorter than that. Aspirationally, we're running pretty aggressively. We have aspirations. We want to list the business, say, within the next 2 to 3 years, right? And we recognize that's ambitious, but we also know the things that we need to unlock in order to get on that path, right? We know that we need to have revenues of a certain size. We need to prove to our audience that we're not just an Australian business, that we're an international business, that we need to have very predictable monthly recurring revenues. So we think about less transactional, more SaaS and stuff like that, right? And we need to evolve our brand so it talks to the proper narrative, which is that B2B, because we've evolved from that little bit of B2C that we had intentionally gone to market with, and we've grown up. So these are the things that we're tackling. And it very much aligns from a business culture perspective, from our OKRs, so our business planning, down. And that's what we're working on kind of quarter to quarter, year to year. So yeah, aspirationally, that's the target. What we won't accept is probably just kind of limping over the line when it comes to that. So we want to be of a certain size. To your point, if we cast, what you said earlier, and I think that's a fair call, is that we have done this before. We know how to make a business that looks and feels like a couple of $100 million. We can, I don't mean this disrespectfully, we can do that with our eyes closed, right? But we know that's 85,000 transacting clients in the background of a cohort, and then that spits out the numbers that you just mentioned. So how can we be bigger? How can we be more global? How can we have more innovation? We can have more, more product, right, to help brands in ways that we haven't done before. So, with that comes greater opportunity for greater valued business, and that's how we think about that. We've got this kind of fail safe, but we really aspirationally want to be much bigger, and it's those bigger numbers that are driving our decisions at a business level to work towards that listing that we just mentioned.
Paul, most of the investments we've made have been in products that we use as a group or clients running those companies. For our listeners who are our investors and clients and other potential investors, what are the things that, they could help with that would make the sort of next best difference in terms of what you're doing? Is it, who are you looking for as a client? Who are you looking to meet?
So, that's a great one. And I think the beauty of what we've spoken about today, right, is that, if you work in a business or if you own a business, then even if you are, a nomad or have come from overseas, and there's a couple of things. We can probably help you with your payment flows, or we can help your business create more value or more efficiencies in your back office, right? So, there's a good chance that anyone that is listening to this, that we should be having a conversation. That's probably first and foremost. In terms of the high level, so, what do we look for? We look for brands in the e-commerce space. We look for brands that have, say, mature client bases that are, they're very loyal to their brand, that might be synonymous with import, export, or migrants, or social. If we profile clients, social AB, so 35 plus disposable incomes, typically, travel a lot. If you have these types of people in and around your business, or if you're advertising online to a global audience, then these are the types of consumers that we can help you with, and we can make you market leader, and we can actually monetize that product for you as well. So think of us more aspirationally as more of a Stripe than more of an FX business, and that will probably be where I'd leave that one.
Perfect. Well, I always like to finish our time together with a question, Paul, which is, if there's a motto, quote, or thought that best summarizes your approach to life and business, what would that be?
I don't know, man. Like, in all honesty, I think if someone was quoting Steve Jobs or the Build Trap to me, man, I probably wouldn't have a beer with them. Put it that way. So maybe that is my quote. But look, I think, if more seriously for a second, I don't really have a particular quote, but what I do find myself thinking about more often than not when it comes to these bigger decisions, or just the smaller stuff, right? It's like, what would my dad do? And I mean that in a really kind of endearing way. Like, my dad was a staff sergeant in the army, right? For 22 years. He's as straight as they come. But as a staff sergeant in the army, that he is probably the epitome of middle management, right? Where he has to deal with a younger officer above him, and then, lead the troops below him, right? So he's that conduit between management and the team. So I think the one thing I learned from him is that, lead from the front. And if you don't do it, then, how can you ask someone else to do it, right? So I think that moral compass that he gave me is probably, if I do think from time to time about something that is meaningful, or I kind of challenge that status quo, then I think that's probably that thought that usually pops up in my head, mate, to be honest. Sorry, no, but no Steve Jobs for you today, mate. I'm sorry, buddy.
No,
maybe next time.
I think that's good. What would my dad do given his background? I think it's a great a great quote. It's really terrific. Hey, well, really nice to spend some time together. We plan to get to each of you guys every 6 months and have a chat and share that with our investors, so that that they can share in the journey. We can't keep all the fun to ourselves. And I'm really looking forward to seeing you develop, Paul. I think what you're doing is really amazing. And as we've said at Kelly+Partners, we're using the product.
Yeah, no, appreciate it, guys. And look, from our side, you guys have been amazing. And I'm excited to work with you guys more, and thank you for the support from both you guys and investors that made this partnership possible, right? It means a lot. It's great.
Terrific.
Thanks, Paul.
Mate, have a great day.
Thank you for listening to the Kelly+Partners Investment Office Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show and found it informative and interesting to learn about our investee companies. If you love this episode, don't forget to follow us and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. As Brett says, have a great day.